When a woman's family members mysteriously pass away, she investigates her former boss, believing he orchestrated the unfortunate events as vengeance for losing his wife and child at a highly publicized book signing for his latest novel. World-renowned author Cluster stands on stage as the crowd breaks out in applause just as he prepares to sign copies of his book. The journalist Esteban suddenly appears and whispers that if he doesn't want to cause a scene, he should head to the third-floor mezzanine and speak with Luciana. The worried man looks up and spots the woman, so he informs the event organizer that he'll be back in a few minutes. Moments later, Cluster arrives at the mezzanine and slowly approaches the distraught Luciana. Meanwhile, a photographer asks Esteban if the rumors about him getting fired from the newspaper are true, but he says it's a complicated situation. Suddenly they hear a loud thud from the other end of the room and the panicked crowd rushes over, worried that Cluster might have fallen off the third-floor railing. 12 years ago, Luciana worked as a writing assistant for the famous author. While typing out his thoughts onto a computer, he asked her where the prisoner's letters were, so she grabbed the binder from the bookshelf and handed it over. Suddenly Cluster's daughter Polly appeared and asked if they're almost done working, so the assistant said she and the girl could play after they'd finished. After the child left, Luciana told the author that she researched poisonous mushrooms for his next book and shared that her mother makes a mushroom pie for her father every year on their anniversary. Then she illustrated an edible mushroom next to a poisonous one and pointed out that despite their similar appearance, the deadly variety had a vulva at the base of the stalk. However, while she continued explaining, the distracted Cluster looked down the clueless woman's pants and saw her undergarments. Later, Luciana played with Polly, who asked if she had any siblings. The former said she had a sister named Valentino as well as two older brothers named Bruno and Romero. Eventually, Cluster's wife Mercedes interrupted the pair and told her child it's time for the writing assistant to go home. Much to her disappointment, by the front door the employee spotted the scars on the woman's arms, so she quickly averted her gaze and pretended she didn't see anything. That evening the writer bathed Polly and took a video of the child happily jumping on the bed. Days before the book signing incident, Esteban saw a news report on TV regarding a devastating fire. Seconds later, the journalist answered a call from Luciana, who introduced herself as his former writing assistant, revealing that the woman worked for both men. She tells the man that they need to meet in private as soon as possible to discuss. Cluster. 12 years ago, Esteban welcomed the writing assistant to his apartment, where she also typed out what the man dictated when he stopped their session because he'd rather write the explicit parts of his novel. She stated that it wouldn't faze her because she's used to the racy content. Cluster asks her to write. Intrigued, Esteban wondered if he's a better writer than her other employer, implying the unspoken rivalry between the two men. In the present, the disheveled woman opens the door to let the journalist into the apartment. Moments later, Luciana explains that for over a decade her family members have mysteriously passed away one by one and she believes Cluster is responsible. The woman says no one believes her, so she asks for Esteban's help to uncover the truth. She adds that she saw the author at her mother's nursing home and thinks he'll come after her next. Skeptical, the journalist wonders if it's all just a coincidence, but Luciana counters that her 58-year-old mother being in a home because of neurological damage is Cluster's doing. Eventually, the woman says she chose Esteban to write and publish her story because she knows he has a score to settle with his longtime rival. 12 years ago, the writing assistant arrived at Cluster's home, where Polly showed her a drawing of her family including the woman. Later, Luciana handed Cluster a rare Bible edition and explained that it belonged to her father, who's a pastor. She added that it might contain a different interpretation of the law of retaliation, in which a punishment resembles the offense committed in kind and degree. However, Cluster said that it's not that different from other interpretations, since it still states that the law of retaliation focuses on generating a punishment equivalent to the suffering inflicted. While the assistant leaned over the table, the author snuck a peek under the clueless woman's blouse. As an example, he shared that his wife used to be a ballet dancer until she got hit by a car and fractured her leg. The man explained that to honor the law it wouldn't be enough to break the careless driver's leg because the suffering he caused Mercedes goes beyond the fracture and destroyed her career. Moments later the woman mentioned working for Esteban, and her boss said the fellow writer sends him manuscripts all the time. Unprompted, she pointed out that while her other boss wrote faster, he didn't have Cluster's talent. Soon they continued working on the novel, and the enamored man described a coin-shaped scar on his female character's shoulder. Interestingly, Luciana said that she had a similar mark on her arm, and she pulled down her cardigan to show the boss. Suddenly Cluster touched his assistant's arm and kissed her on the lips. Much to her surprise, shocked, she pulled away, and the confused author wondered if he had misunderstood her, thinking it was what she wanted. To end the awkward situation, the writing assistant cut the session short and left immediately. Later that day, the indignant Mercedes arrived home with their daughter, and her exasperation with Polly implies a strange relationship between the mother and child. Meanwhile, Luciana's family, including her parents, brothers Bruno and Romero, and sister Valentina, waited for her at the dining table, but the Fruit woman lied about having a stomachache and headed directly to her room. Concerned, her mother asked if something happened at work, but all she said was that she wouldn't work for Cluster anymore. Later that night, Mercedes told her husband that she still had trouble connecting with their daughter, so he encouraged her to just be patient. When the man suggested they spend time together as a family tomorrow, the wife reminded him of his writing session, so he lied and said that Luciana quit to focus on her studies. Days later, the woman and her mom met with a lawyer to file a harassment case against the author. In the present, Esteban sympathizes with the assistant but clarifies that he can't publish a story accusing Cluster without any proof. However, she explains that she doesn't care if no one believes her, because she just wants the story to go public so that the author thinks twice before making his next move, since people would immediately suspect him if another family member passes away. Nonetheless, the journalist thinks he has nothing to gain from it. To coax Esteban, the woman theorizes that Cluster sabotaged his career by using his connections to blackball him from publishers after he wrote a piece on what happened to Mercedes and Paulie. Suddenly, the now teenaged Valentina enters the apartment, so her sister introduces her to the journalist in the hallway. Luciana shares that she chose not to tell her sibling about the connections between Cluster and the losses in their family 12 years ago. During the case mediation, the author wrote a check for the exact amount demanded in the harassment lawsuit, returned the woman's Bible, and immediately left the meeting. When the former writing assistant mentioned how she's never seen the man behave that way, the lawyer said that it may be because of his wife and daughter's tragic passing. That evening, the woman lay in bed and mourned Mercedes and Polly as she stared at the girl's drawing on the wall. Then her father comforted her and encouraged her to join the rest of the family on a summer beach trip. Weeks later, while the family lounged on the sand, Romero, who was working part-time as a lifeguard, asked Luciana to refill the tumbler with more water. To her horror, she saw Cluster dining at the restaurant and wondered what he was doing. Later that day, her brother and father believed she merely imagined seeing the author, but she remembered telling him about her family's beach house. However, her mother reminded her that she didn't cash the check out of pity, so it wouldn't make any sense for Cluster to hold a grudge. The next day, a storm arose, and while everyone else fled to the nearby shelter, Romero stayed behind to make sure no one was left in the water. When the sky finally cleared up, Luciana spotted a crowd by the beach and to her horror saw Bruno trying to resuscitate Romero, who drowned during the storm. Suddenly she saw Cluster menacingly smiling in the crowd, but after looking away for a split second, the author seemingly vanished into thin air. During the funeral, the father comforted his crying daughter and assured her that it was an accident. Days later, Luciana wrote a handwritten letter addressed to her former employer. In the present, Esteban's editor-in-chief says he'll only publish the story if he has irrefutable proof for Cluster's side of the story. Years ago, the woman greeted her parents with a happy anniversary over the phone because she was staying in her apartment while her family was in the beach house. The mother shared they took Valentina foraging earlier to find ingredients for her anniversary mushroom pie. Hours later, Luciana answered a call from Bruno informing her that he's in an ambulance due to an emergency involving both of their parents at the hospital. The woman learned that her father perished and her mother suffered from organ failure after ingesting the mushroom pie. Seconds later, she told Bruno that Cluster was responsible because she told him about the mushroom pie and that her parents celebrated their anniversary at the beach house every year. The brother begged her not to mention the outlandish theory at such an inopportune time, but she insisted that the author never forgave her and wanted to ruin her life. In the present, Esteban visits the beach house and checks the mushrooms growing in the vicinity. Later he runs into a neighbor who also thinks it's strange that the mother made a mistake in identifying the mushrooms. The lady adds that Valentina might have foraged the poisonous fungi since she probably didn't know better. Years ago Mercedes received an envelope addressed to her husband and saw Luciana's harassment complaint that evening. The woman gave Paulie a bath in the tub, and when the child repeatedly exclaimed how much she wanted to see the writing assistant, the jealous mother fatally hurt her daughter. In disbelief of what she'd done, Mercedes dazedly walked to the bedroom and ingested a handful of medication. Hours later Cluster arrived home and found his lifeless wife in bed and the harassment claim on the table. Then the man discovered the child's body in the bathtub and mournfully wailed as he lifted her out of the water. Years later, when Bruno pulled into the hospital parking lot to begin his shift, a deranged man grabbed him from his vehicle, demanded that he stay away from his wife and beat him lifeless. Eventually Officer Ramona told Luciana that the perpetrator claimed that her brother was having an affair with his wife, but the woman insisted that Bruno was single. Then the cop mentioned that they didn't know how the attacker escaped from prison, and she remembered that Cluster used to write letters to inmates, so she told the officer that he somehow orchestrated the prison escape and fabricated an affair between her brother and the man's wife, since he's been eliminating her family members while he had a hard time believing the outlandish claim. He promised to follow every lead in the case. In the present, Officer Ramona tells Esteban that they didn't find a connection between Cluster and the man who took Bruno's life, and that the prisoner escaped because corrupt guards regularly released inmates to commit crimes. The cop also mentions that Luciana kept coming to the station and made outrageous accusations about the famous writer that afternoon. The editor-in-chief informs the journalist that Cluster agreed to a meeting tonight. Hours later, Esteban allows the author to read the news story he wrote about Luciana's claim. However, the writer insinuates that his former writing assistant is insane and manipulative. When the journalist asks him to elaborate, Cluster says Luciana used her innocent beauty to tempt him, and the price he had to pay for falling for her trap was his family. Esteban wonders if the man blames the woman for the tragedy, so the author shows him Luciana's letter in which he claims she apologized for the absurd accusations. He also believes the former writing assistant felt immense guilt for tearing the family apart. Then the journalist asks Cluster why he was at the beach when Romero drowned, and the latter reasons that he had just lost his wife and child and dropped by the beach because he thought it was unfair that the woman got to spend time with her family. He denies having anything to do with Romero's demise and says there's no way a frail man of his age could overpower a lifeguard in his 20s. When Esteban points out that he knew about Luciana's parents' mushroom buyer and that she thinks he wrote to the prisoner and fabricated the affair with Bruno, Cluster emphasizes that these connections are also mere coincidences. The journalist counters that the likelihood of them being coincidental lowers significantly given the complicated situation between the author and his former writing assistant. However, Cluster believes that losing 3 family members over a decade doesn't seem suspicious. Then he takes a stab onto his daughter's room and shows him the projected looping video of the child jumping in bed, implying that he still hasn't recovered from the grief, and blames Luciana for taking his family from him. Seconds later, Cluster reveals that Bruno had his sister institutionalized because she was obsessed with him. To conclude the meeting, he says Esteban only agreed to help her because he envied his success, which is why he wrote the piece on Mercedes and Paulie's demise. Several days ago the sisters visited their mother in the nursing home, but as they walked out of the building, the terrified Luciana spotted her former boss inside a store. After returning to the apartment, she called Esteban and asked to meet him in person to discuss Cluster in there. The journalist investigates a fire at a nursing home but is unable to interview the deranged arsonist before the police take him away. Suddenly the distraught Luciana appears and tells Esteban that if he'd done his job and published the story like she wanted, her mother would still be alive, implying that she believes Cluster was behind the fire. Then as the man watches the crime scene, investigator check the suspect's belongings. He spots Cluster's book. The next day the editor-in-chief unnears Esteban's decade-old piece on the author and theorizes that he only wants to publish his newest story for a personal vendetta, even though the man tries to explain that Luciana's case has nothing to do with his history with the novelist. The boss fires him from the paper anyway. That evening the horrified woman overhears her sister telling a friend that she interviewed Clauster for a writing assignment. She adds that she doesn't want Luciana to know because their older sister forbids her from reading any of the author's books. Fearing for Valentina's life, the woman heads to the journalist's apartment and asks him to set up a meeting with the writer. On TV they see a news report about Cluster's book signing event, so Esteban says they can sneak into the building using his press pass. Soon the author heads to the third-floor mezzanine and the defeated woman says he's had his perfect revenge and she has no more suffering to give. Luciana believes they've experienced an equal amount of grief, but the man counters that only he gets to say that she's suffered enough. Eventually the woman realizes that the only way to satisfy Clauster is to take her own life. She asks the author how she can be sure that no harm will befall Valentina, so he promises that nothing bad will happen to the sister. Moments later Luciana climbs over the mezzanine railing and leaps to her end, shocking the crowd below. The stunned journalist slowly approaches their lifeless body, and when he looks up he sees Cluster staring down at them. Days later, during the woman's cremation, Esteban finds the author comforting the crying Valentina. After the teen steps out of the room, he tells the novelist he still doesn't know if what happened to Luciana was a series of bad luck or part of his revenge. Then he points out that Valentina is still a teenager, but Cluster counters that she'll be of age next week, implying a despicable plan to make her his lover. When Esteban calls him a murderer, the ruthless author tells him to be careful or he'll end up just like Luciana.